While I certainly enjoy many wines from well-known regions such as Bordeaux, Burgundy, and Napa Valley, I also enjoy high-quality wines from obscure grapes, as well as high-quality wines from regions that are less mainstream. So in this video, I've compiled 13 of my favorite recommendations for more eclectic wines. Chenin Blanc and wines from Loire generally are both things that I should enjoy more often. There's some exceptional wines at very reasonable prices. One example is the 2021 Clos de Mosny from Domaine de la Taille aux Loups. Domaine de la Taille aux Loups is a producer that started out in the late 1980s with only 7 hectares of vineyards, through acquisitions that has subsequently expanded to more than 60 hectares. One of the most recent acquisitions, and a savvy one at that, was the Clos de Mosny vineyard in the Mont-Louis appellation. As the name suggests, this is a walled vineyard that has south-facing aspect and is also located in the southern part of the Mont-Louis appellation. Clos de Mosny is a certified organic wine that is 100% Chenin Blanc from 40 to 50-year-old vines that are grown in the famous Silex soils. Silex soils are flint and sand-based soils that are formed from a mixture of clay, limestone, and silica. These soils help to accumulate heat and ensure early ripening, which is useful in the Loire given its marginal northerly climate. Interestingly, wine produced from silex soils also tends to have descriptors that include wet stone and a smoky component. And so if that's something that's appealing for you, this wine definitely may be a good choice for you and one that you'd like to try. This wine was matured in oak barrels, but only 20% of them were new, so the maturation process will add some texture without providing any oak flavors and aromas. This is a wine that you can enjoy now, but it's also extremely age-worthy, and you could age it for up to 20 years or so in your cellar without any problems at all. So if you're interested in this wine, my recommendation would be to purchase at least 3 or 4 bottles, if not more, so that you can try one now, but then also try one periodically after it has some additional bottle age in your cellar. This is definitely one that will reward bottle aging and will become extremely complex over the years. Arneis means little rascal, and this Italian white grape is aptly named because it's extremely difficult to grow. So difficult, in fact, that it almost became extinct in the 1960s. But Bruno Giacosa and one other Italian producer helped save it from extinction. And the Giacosa Roero Arneis is one of my absolute favorite white wines from the Piedmont region. I first discovered Roero Arneis when I was traveling in the Piedmont region of Italy, and I was looking for a white wine to pair with some of my starting courses, while the red wine was in the decanter. I soon discovered that this is an exceptional white wine for pairing with some of those early courses, and it goes extremely well with seafood and pasta, in addition to salads and other typical starting courses. Better still, Roero Arneis is typically found on most Italian restaurant wine lists, and so it's one that you should be able to find with no difficulty at all. Better still, despite the fact that Bruno Giacosa is a legendary winemaker, this wine sells for an extremely reasonable price. Even in the United States at retail, you can find it for around $30 a bottle, and on restaurant wine lists, it'd probably be around $65 or so, and it's going to be even less than that in Europe. If you're not familiar with Roero Arneis, it can include flavors and aromas such as lemon, peach, pineapple, apricot, floral notes, and also some intriguing minerality that I appreciate. It tends to be around medium plus in body, and it can be a little bit lower in acidity, but it is generally quite well balanced, especially if you get the example from Bruno Giacosa or from Vietti, which is another Roero Arneis that I think is a pretty good example and one that I would recommend. One of the reasons that I don't feature South African wines more frequently on this channel is because very few of the good ones make their way to Dallas, Texas, which is where I'm based. So it was a real treat to be able to taste the next wine at Texom. This is the 2020 Sadie family Palladius. This is an extremely impressive white blend that includes numerous grapes. The precise composition of the Palladius will vary from vintage to vintage, but it's always Chenin Blanc dominant. The 2020 vintage included Chenin Blanc, Grenache Blanc, Roussanne, Marsanne, Viognier, Palomino, Colombard, and several others. This wine had a bit of a waxy texture, but also lots of freshness and acidity due to the high percentage of Chenin Blanc. Descriptors for this wine included lemon, ginger, citrus blossom, honeysuckle, and wet rock. This wine matured for 12 months in concrete and then another 12 months in Old Oak Foudre. This is wine that's unfined and unfiltered. This was my first experience with this impressive wine, but definitely hopefully not my last. I was a bit surprised that the price for this wine is $150 a bottle, but nevertheless, this is a world-class wine, and it's one that I definitely hope to try again in the near term, perhaps in a blind tasting with some other extremely impressive white wines from other parts of the world, and then see who comes out on top and how well it fares compared to those other wines. Although it's true that many collectible wines are expensive, they certainly do not have to be. This next collectible wine is an excellent example of that, as it sells for a very reasonable $40 a bottle. I'm talking about the 2020 Domaine Zind-Humbrecht Clos Jebsal Pinot Gris, which is from Alsace, France. This is the first dry Pinot Gris that Domaine Zind-Humbrecht has produced from this vineyard. This is a single vineyard wine, and it's a 1.3 hectare vineyard that's located on a steep south-facing slope, and it's just below a Grand Cru vineyard that's called Brand. This vineyard was replanted to Pinot Gris back in 1983, so the vines are getting close to 40 years old or so, and they're grown biodynamically. Historically, this fruit has been used to make an outstanding botrytis wine, but that's become progressively more challenging with global warming. The 2020 vintage in Alsace was extremely warm, and so the producer went ahead and harvested this fruit before botrytis could even set in, and then set out to make a wine that was bone dry. They succeeded wonderfully, and this wine was well received by critics. It's a wine that still has the descriptors that fans of the Clos Jebsal vineyard have come to appreciate, namely the telltale floral and honey aromas along with a creamy texture, but it is nevertheless bone dry, and it's a surprisingly light wine at around 13% ABV or so. This is a wine that's certainly capable of extended bottle aging, so there's definitely no rush to open this one. This first wine comes from Piemonte and is a special wine that was traditionally drunk only at festivals or special occasions. There's less than 30 producers that make this wine, and there's less than 150 hectares of this grape that are planted. The Bava family has grown grapes in the Castagnole Monferrato territory for more than 400 years and producing wine in that region for more than 100 years. Now run by the fourth generation, Bava produces the first of my top wines that sell for around $30 per bottle that I discovered at Texam, namely the 2020 Bava Ruche Castagnole Monferrato DOCG. The suggested retail price on this wine is only $25, so this one is an absolute screaming bargain at that price. But this wine is 100% Ruche, and Ruche can only be made in 7 different municipalities in Monferrato. This was my first exposure to Ruche, and I would describe it as a fairly aromatic wine. I detected descriptors that included roses, violets, blackberry, raspberry, and an intriguing white pepper descriptor that I really enjoyed. Despite low overall acidity, there is quite a bit of freshness to this wine, and I discovered that that was due to the fact that it has a relatively high proportion of malic acid. But as I was at the table enjoying this wine, a master of wine came up to me, and she was both surprised and impressed that I was enjoying this wine, since there were much more expensive wines on the table. But this is a wine that she absolutely loves as well, and was raving about it. This wine is extremely enjoyable on release, and you can enjoy it for up to 5 years or so. It's very rare to be able to get such a unique, soulful wine for only $25 a bottle, so this one is an absolute no-brainer. Muller-Catoir is one of my favorite German producers. This is a historic family producer that dates way back to the 1740s. It's currently run by the 9th generation. Impressively, despite the fact that Muller-Catoir has 25 hectares of vines, they have only around 25 employees, plus some seasonal workers. Muller-Catoir embraces traditional winemaking principles. Among other things, this means that they hand harvest, and they use very slow, long fermentations for their wines. So the next top wine for $25 a bottle is the 2020 Muller-Catoir Riesling Trocken. And this is not a sweet wine. Despite the fact that it's Riesling, there's many outstanding dry Rieslings that are being made today, such as this one. You can tell it's dry due to the use of the word Trocken in the name. And in fact, this one has only about 4.4 grams of residual sugar. This is an extremely vibrant, concentrated wine, especially given the fact that it only has around 12.5% alcohol by volume. While it's difficult to find wines that offer a lot of complexity at the $25 price point, this wine is definitely one of them. It's definitely a wine that will continue to improve with age, and if you're going to enjoy it young, I would probably even give it a little bit of a decant. I'm not shy about decanting German Rieslings, especially when they're young. To do that and to help maintain the proper temperature, what I'll typically do is put the decanter right on a bucket of ice, and that works like a charm. Well, I'm not generally much of a Pinot Grigio guy. There were actually a few very interesting expressions of Pinot Grigio that were quite impressive at the James Suckling Great Wines of the World event. One of the most intriguing of these was the 2021 Marjan Simcic Ramato Pinot Grigio Cru Selection. This is a family-owned producer, and they've been in the wine business since way back in 1860. This winery is currently run by the fifth generation. They have vines on both Italian and Slovenian soil, and some of their vines are an impressive 55 years of age. James Suckling gave this impressive wine a 95-point score, and in my opinion, it was well-deserved. The fruit for this wine is grown in a vineyard that is planted in Opoka soils. The vines average 44 years of age. They have southeast-facing exposure, and the vineyard is planted at 250 meters above sea level. There's an interesting production process for this wine, as this wine is fermented in 2,500-liter conical oak barrels, and it actually ferments on the skins despite the fact that it's white wine. After that, it matures on the lees for 1 year, and then it spends another 6 months in bottle before it's released. The skin contact during fermentation is quite unusual for a white wine, and it actually imparted a very intriguing texture to this wine that I really appreciated. This was an extraordinarily complex wine. It's somewhat rare for a white wine to include red fruit descriptors, but this wine definitely had red apple and raspberry. It's a wine that comes in at around 14% alcohol by volume and is well worth trying if you're looking for an interesting eclectic wine. This is a wine that I found selling in the UK for around £23 and in the United States for about $49 per bottle. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. 2021 was an exceptional vintage for German Riesling. So if you're interested in German Riesling, definitely be sure to stock up on your favorite producers from that vintage. One of my personal favorites is Dönhoff. So my next top wine for $40 a bottle is a 2021 Dönhoff Dry Riesling that's from the Roxheimer Hohenpfad vineyard. Interestingly, the name for this vineyard means path to hell, and this name was likely motivated by the steepness of the slope as well as the uniquely colored red sandstone that dots the vineyard. These special sandstone soils help to produce a mineral-driven wine of great complexity with spicy, peppery fruit flavors. This is a wine that has the structure to age for decades, but it's also well-balanced and elegant with about 12.5% alcohol by volume. Simply an outstanding wine. The next top wine for $60 a bottle is one that I discovered during a trip to Spain. During one of my first meals that trip, a sommelier recommended this wine, and it's been one of my favorites ever since. I'm talking about the Rafael Palacios as Sorts Godeo. This is a wine that comes from the Valdeorras portion of Spain, which is in Galicia. This is an extremely impressive wine and my absolute favorite pairing for seafood paella. This is a wine that matures for 7 months in 500-liter oak barrels. The vines date back to the 1970s and the early 1980s, which is certainly extremely old for Godeo. This wine checks in at around 14.5% alcohol by volume. It's definitely a very elegant, refined wine. Some people even compare it to a Puligny Montrachet. 2021 was definitely a cooler vintage as well, so this is probably one of the most elegant expressions of As Sorts ever produced. Rudi Pichler is one of the top producers in Austria's Vaha region, and the next top wine for $60 a bottle is a Riesling Smaragd from the outstanding 2022 vintage. This is a wine that received an impressive 98-point score from James Suckling, and so it wouldn't surprise me at all if this wine makes his top 100 wines for 2024 later this year. One of the things I like best about Vaha Riesling is that almost all of them are dry. It would be extremely unusual for a Wachau producer to have residual sugar in their wines. This is definitely a prime example of that. This wine comes in at 13% alcohol by volume. It's a mineral-driven wine and one that has descriptors that include stone fruit, and there's definitely ample acidity as well, as you might suspect for a Riesling. The next top wine for $60 a bottle comes from one of the benchmark producers in Loire, Domaine Huet. Domaine Huet began biodynamic farming practices long before that was in vogue and was one of the earliest adopters of biodynamics. The 2022 Domaine Huet Le Mont Moelleux is a wine that comes from Vouvray, and it's 100% Chenin Blanc. This is a wine that you can definitely expect to have some medium levels of sweetness. So if you're only looking for a dry wine, this is definitely not the wine for you. When this wine is in its youth, it's particularly reticent and it's not very aromatic, but with time, it becomes extremely aromatic and has pronounced aromatic intensity. So it's definitely one that I would put away in the back of your cellar for about 10 years or so. The next intriguing Italian white wine was first produced in 1995. It comes from southern Italy, and along with the Terre Alte, discussed earlier, is widely regarded as one of the very best white wines in all of Italy. Somewhat surprisingly, this wine comes from the Amalfi Coast DOC. I'm talking about the Marisa Cuomo Fiore Bianco Fiorduva. I first discovered this impressive wine when I was dining in Rome last fall, and a sommelier suggested it. It was a brilliant wine that paired perfectly with a seafood sampler, with cod, and with scallops. Fiorduva is a blend of 3 obscure and indigenous Italian white grapes. These grapes are grown in vines that average 80 years of age on south-facing coastal terraces at elevations ranging from 200 meters to 550 meters above sea level. While you might think that the Amalfi Coast is too warm to produce high-quality white wine, in fact, it's an absolutely magical place to produce white wine. This is so because the elevation provides some cooling influences, and they also use pergola training for the grapes, which helps to shade them from the afternoon sun. There's a couple different ways that you can tell if a wine is particularly complex. One of them is the length of the finish, and this one had an extraordinarily long finish. The other is if you're able to readily identify numerous discrete descriptors, and here there were almost too many different discrete descriptors to recount. But the readily identifiable flavors and aromas for this wine included grapefruit, apricot, pineapple, mango, citron, peach, honey, almonds, jasmine, and wet rock. This wine was bone dry with impressive minerality and abundant acidity. Really an impressive wine with an extraordinarily long finish. Definitely one that I would seek out and make sure you get a chance to taste it. Certainly a worthy bucket list wine, and I can see why many people consider it to be one of the best white wines in all of Italy. One of my very favorite wine trips was a visit to Santorini, Greece. I ended up visiting a number of producers there, including Gaia, which has a tasting room that's ideally located right on the Aegean Sea. One of my favorite wines from that trip was the Assyrtiko. For those who are not familiar with Assyrtiko, it's a bone-dry white wine that can be full-bodied with very, very high acidity, and it has descriptors that often include stone, citrus, and tropical fruits. Interestingly, there are such harsh conditions that they need to train their vines in basket shape. They then train the grapes so that they're in the middle of the basket, and that this basket helps to protect these grapes from the harsh winds and fierce conditions in Santorini. Due to the fact that they have volcanic soils, they've never experienced phylloxera in Santorini. And so they do have a number of very old, impressive vines that create some concentrated, complex wines. Assyrtiko is one of my favorites because it pairs extremely well with seafood. And this is a very impressive wine and one of my favorites, and it sells for around $40 per bottle. If you enjoyed this video, you're almost certainly a fan of German Riesling, so be sure to check out my 2-part deep dive into German Riesling that's linked above.